In the vast, luminous arms of the Milky Way, there exists a civilization so ancient, so breathtakingly advanced, that they had already solved cold fusion while humanity was still arguing about whether the Earth was round. The Zephyrians, tall, lavender-skinned beings with 4 optical receptors and a fondness for calculus-themed poetry, considered themselves the undisputed pinnacle of cosmic intelligence. And no Zephyrian embodied this belief more completely, more obnoxiously, or more loudly than Professor Vrindak Kalaseth. Professor Kalaseth stood at precisely 2.4 meters tall, wore a robe stitched from condensed starlight, and carried a quantum resonance datapad that could calculate the mass of a black hole faster than you could say general relativity. He had 17 academic titles, 22 honorary doctorates from 9 different star systems, and an ego that could comfortably orbit a gas giant. He had also, quite recently, accepted what he believed would be the most boring assignment of his distinguished career, a 6-month cultural observation mission to Earth. Planet Sol 3. Home of primitive bipeds, as his mission briefing so diplomatically phrased it. 6 months, he muttered to his assistant, a nervous young Zephyrian named Tilrek Asavane, as their cloaked vessel descended through a blanket of clouds toward the northeastern coast of North America. 6 months among creatures who only discovered interstellar radio signals 40 years ago. 6 months observing beings who still cook food using thermal combustion. Tilrek, who was 22 solar cycles old and desperately eager to please, tapped his datapad anxiously. With respect, Professor, our preliminary scans suggest these humans have made some interesting developments. Their particle physics. Tilrek. Kalaseth fixed all 4 of his amber eyes on his assistant. Humans invented something called the microwave oven because they accidentally irradiated a chocolate bar. Their greatest philosopher once said, "To be or not to be," and considered that a complete thought. I think I can manage. Their cover identities had been prepared by the Zephyrian Intelligence Bureau with considerable care. Professor Vrindak Kalaseth would pose as Dr. Wendell Krax, a visiting professor of theoretical physics from Geneva, Switzerland. Tilrek would be Theo Krax, his graduate student nephew. Their bodies had been biologically adjusted to resemble humans, shorter, pinkish-beige skin, only 2 eyes, though Kalaseth complained bitterly about losing 2 of his optical receptors and walked into 3 door frames in the first hour. Their destination, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. The campus was buzzing when they arrived on a crisp Tuesday morning in October. Students rushed between red brick buildings clutching coffee cups and laptops, arguing about quantum field theory and orbital mechanics. A banner across the main entrance read, "Welcome to MIT's annual innovation showcase." "Ah," said Kalaseth, adjusting his human-shaped glasses, a prop he found both pointless and aesthetically offensive, "a primitive science fair. How quaint." Tilrek said nothing. He was staring at a whiteboard visible through a classroom window, covered in equations so dense they looked like organized chaos. He recognized perhaps 60% of the notation. The rest was entirely unfamiliar. He made a mental note not to mention this to the professor. Their contact at MIT was Dr. Priya Subramaniam, associate chair of the physics department, who met them at the administrative building with a warm handshake and an expression of genuine excitement. She was a compact, sharp-eyed woman in her early 40s with ink on her fingers and what appeared to be a dried coffee stain on her blazer that she either hadn't noticed or had decided was a personality trait. "Dr. Krax. Welcome to MIT," she said, pumping Kalaseth's hand enthusiastically. "We're thrilled to have you. Your paper on hypothetical vacuum energy conversion was, honestly I have to say, the most bizarre thing I've ever read in a peer-reviewed journal. We had 3 different teams try to disprove it for 8 months and couldn't." Kalaseth smiled the smile of a being who had dumbed down his actual research by approximately 4,000% and still nearly broke human science. "I do try to keep things accessible," he said. "Right?" said Priya with a slightly uncertain laugh. "Well, I'll give you the tour. Fair warning, things here can get a little chaotic." "I find that hard to believe," said Kalaseth. He would later describe what happened next as the first major miscalculation of his career. The tour of MIT's advanced research labs took 3 hours, and by the end of the first hour, Kalaseth had gone quiet in a way that Tilrek recognized as dangerous, the particular silence of a being who was being forced to update their priors. The quantum computing lab was running coherence tests that surpassed anything Zephyrian science had achieved with similar materials. The aerospace engineering students were redesigning atmospheric entry trajectories using a self-correcting algorithm that one second-year PhD student had apparently written on a bet. In the basement of Building 26, A team of undergraduates was testing a room-temperature superconductor using materials that, by all laws of Zephyrian physics, should not have worked. "What is that?" Kaliseth whispered to Tilrek, staring through reinforced glass at the superconductor rig. "According to the placard," Tilrek said carefully, "it's a project by 3 undergraduate students. Average age, 19. Kaliseth blinked. Both eyes. Which, in a 4-eyed species now reduced to 2, was still a significant reaction. 19, he repeated. "Yes, Professor. And they built that by themselves. With a budget of, apparently, $4,000 and leftover parts from a 3D printing lab." A very long pause. "I see," said Kaliseth. "And then, it's probably not calibrated correctly." It was, in fact, calibrated perfectly. By the time Priya brought them to the main showcase hall, where student teams were presenting their projects to visiting academics and industry representatives, Kaliseth had adopted the expression of a man determined not to look impressed. His jaw was set. His posture was rigid. His datapad was quietly running 17 simultaneous calculations because it kept encountering data points that didn't fit its existing models. And then Priya stopped in front of a booth manned by a lanky, wild-haired young man in a MIT hoodie who was eating a vending machine granola bar and reading 4 papers simultaneously. The sign above his booth read, "Recursive Self-Optimization in Emergent Neural Architectures, Toward Machine Intuition." "This," said Priya with obvious pride, "is Devraj Osei, second-year PhD student. His work just got submitted to Nature Physics. Devraj, meet Dr. Wendell Krax, our visiting professor from Geneva." Devraj looked up from his stack of papers, grinned, and stuck out a hand that still had granola crumbs on it. "Hey. Big fan of your vacuum energy paper, Dr. Krax. Took me 3 weeks to figure out why it worked, and honestly I'm still not entirely sure I'm right." Kaliseth shook the granola-dusted hand on autopilot. "What exactly is your research proposing?" Devraj's eyes lit up. "Oh, okay, so, basically, I think machine learning systems can be designed to develop genuine intuitive leaps. Not just pattern recognition. Actual nonlinear inferential jumps that mirror biological insight. I built a small prototype last semester." "A prototype," Kaliseth said slowly. "Yeah, it's over here." The prototype was a device the size of a shoebox, assembled from off-the-shelf components, a second-hand neural processing unit, and what appeared to be a modified gaming console. It was also, Kaliseth's quietly shrieking internal sensors told him, operating on a computational principle that Zephyrian science had theorized but never successfully implemented. Kaliseth stared at the shoebox. The shoebox hummed quietly, solving problems. "How long did this take you to build?" Kaliseth asked. "About 3 weeks," said Devraj. "Most of that was waiting for parts to ship. The actual assembly was like a weekend." Tilrek placed a cautious hand on the professor's arm. "Professor," he murmured, "your eye is twitching." "My eye," said Kaliseth with immense dignity, "is not twitching." His eye was absolutely twitching. That evening, in the faculty apartment MIT had arranged for them, Kaliseth sat in silence for 47 minutes before turning to Tilrek and saying, in a very controlled voice, "Update my mission parameters. I want full behavioral and cognitive scans on every researcher in that building." "Of course, Professor," said Tilrek. "Should I also note in my log that you seem surprised?" "You should note," said Kaliseth, "that Earth remains a primitive planet of limited interest, and that I remain entirely unimpressed." "Noted," said Tilrek. And he noted, carefully, exactly what he had observed. Outside, in the cool October night, MIT hummed with light and thought and the sound of young minds doing impossible things for fun. The planet of limited interest continued its rotation, indifferent and brilliant. Professor Vrindak Kaliseth, currently operating under the human alias Dr. Wendell Krax from Geneva, had a plan. It was, like all of his plans, meticulous, intellectually superior, and completely infallible. He would design an experiment so far beyond human capability that it would conclusively prove Earth's scientific primitivism, restore his comfortable sense of cosmic superiority, and give him a proper research paper to publish upon his return to Zephyria. Something along the lines of, "Observations of Cognitive Ceiling Among Sol 3 Bipedal Organisms, a Confirmation of Expected Intellectual Limitations." He'd had the title ready since before the ship landed. The experiment was elegant in its cruelty. Kaliseth designed it using Zephyrian theoretical physics, dumbed down, naturally, to what he estimated was a challenging but achievable level for advanced human researchers. He framed it as a collaborative problem, A multivariable quantum resonance equation with 17 interlocking parameters, where any error in one cascaded through the others. It had taken him about 20 minutes to construct. He calculated it would take the humans approximately 4 to 6 months to solve, if they ever managed it at all. He presented it to Priya Subramaniam over coffee in the faculty dining hall on his third day. "I'm working on a theoretical framework," he said, sliding a printed copy of the equations across the table, "and I'd love to get some fresh perspectives from your department." "No pressure, of course. It's quite complex." Priya looked at the equations. She turned the page over, confirming there was nothing on the back. She turned it back and read it again. Then she said, "Yes," said Kalaseth. "It's rather involved. Can I show this to a few people?" "Of course. Take your time." Priya took the paper, folded it carefully, and tucked it into her blazer pocket. Kalaseth sipped his coffee and permitted himself a small, satisfied smile. By 4 p.m. the same day, he received an email from Priya with an attached document titled, "Preliminary Thoughts Cracks Resonance Problem." The document was 11 pages long. It contained a complete solution to 7 of the 17 parameters. By someone named Juniper Adderley Qualsh, a third-year PhD student who apparently worked on quantum coherence problems and had tackled Kalaseth's equations during lunch. During lunch. Kalaseth read the document 3 times. Then he called Tilrek into the room. "Tilrek. Professor? This student." He held up the printout. "Juniper Adderley Qualsh. I want her full academic profile." Tilrek had it within minutes, because he had been quietly building dossiers on all the researchers since the first day. He was that kind of assistant. 26 years old. MSc from University of Lagos at age 22, top of her cohort. PhD track here at MIT specializing in quantum information theory. She also, apparently, teaches a free Saturday morning math class for high school students at a local community center. "She solved 7 of my parameters during lunch," said Kalaseth. "It appears so. And then went to teach children math on her day off." "Correct." Pause. "What kind of creatures are these?" he said, but it came out less dismissive than he intended. Came out almost like wonder. The following morning, Kalaseth returned to the research wing and arranged to formally meet Juniper Adderley Qualsh. She was exactly as her profile suggested, brilliant, brisk, and completely unbothered by anything. She had natural hair pulled back with a pencil stuck through it, which she occasionally removed to write equations on whatever surface was nearest, including once on Kalaseth's sleeve when she ran out of whiteboard space. "Your framing of the resonance cascade is interesting," she said, sketching furiously, "but I think you're approaching parameters 9 through 12 wrong. You're treating them as sequential, but they're actually concurrent. See here?" She wrote 3 lines of notation that should have taken an hour of careful derivation. "Like that. The whole thing collapses into a single coherent system." Kalaseth stared at what she'd written on his sleeve. It was correct. Completely, devastatingly correct. "I see," he said very carefully. "Is this for a paper?" "Yes," he said. "For a paper. Cool. Let me know if you want a co-author." She wandered back to her desk and resumed simultaneously reading 2 papers and eating a container of leftover jollof rice, apparently having forgotten the entire exchange in favor of whatever new thought had already replaced it. Kalaseth stood very still for a moment. Then he pulled out his datapad and sent a message to the ship. "Revise mission assessment. Preliminary data suggests Earth researchers may exceed Tier 2 classification. Requesting expanded scanning permissions." The message came back quickly. "Granted. What classification are you upgrading to?" Kalaseth looked at Juniper. He looked at the 11-page document on his tablet. He thought about the shoebox that thought. "Unknown," he sent back. "Stand by." Meanwhile, Tilrek had been conducting his own investigations with considerably more enthusiasm than his superior. He'd gotten coffee with Devraj Osei, who had explained his neural architecture prototype in casual, unstoppable detail while periodically wandering off to get snacks from a vending machine he'd clearly been to 40 times. Tilrek had also met Xiomara Reyes-Fontaine, a postdoctoral researcher in materials science who was so casually discussing carbon nanotube lattice structures that it took Tilrek 12 minutes to realize she wasn't reading from a textbook. She was describing her own work. "This is extraordinary," Tilrek told Kalaseth that evening, barely containing his excitement. "Professor, they operate with incomplete information and still arrive at correct conclusions. They call it intuition, or a hunch, or, Devraj called it, vibes. He solved a fundamental problem in neural pathway optimization and described it as having good vibes about the approach." "Vibes?" said Kalaseth flatly. Yes. And he was right. Kaliseth stared at the ceiling of their faculty apartment. The ceiling was white and featureless and told him nothing helpful. The experiment, he said finally. Tomorrow. We run the actual lab experiment. He had designed it as a secondary test, a physical apparatus, not just a theoretical problem. It involved constructing a resonance chamber using highly specific parameters, which he had provided to the department with a list of components. He had assumed procurement would take weeks and construction would be imperfect. He arrived at Lab 24B the next morning to find the apparatus already assembled. Devraj was there yawning over a coffee cup. Juniper was recalibrating something. Xiomara was reading a material spec sheet. 3 other researchers he hadn't met yet were making notes. Priya was standing in the corner with her arms crossed, looking pleased. "We got started last night," Priya said. "Hope that's okay." The team got excited. "They built it overnight," said Kaliseth. The components were mostly already in the lab. Devraj improvised a few connections with parts from his prototype. "Actually made some improvements, show him, Dev." Devraj pointed at a junction in the resonance chamber that Kaliseth had designed as a single-use bottleneck. "Yeah, your original design had a pressure buildup risk here. I rerouted the feedback loop here and here, so it self-regulates. It's more stable now. Also probably more efficient." Kaliseth looked at where Devraj was pointing. The modification was objectively better than his own design. He said nothing for 11 seconds. "Acceptable," he said finally. Tilrek, standing behind him, was writing in his personal log so fast his stylus was smoking. They ran the experiment that afternoon. Kaliseth had designed it to test the upper limits of human comprehension. The predicted result would be partial success at best, a failed apparatus at worst. The chamber was supposed to sustain a resonance field for approximately 30 seconds before the parameters exceeded controllable range. The resonance field sustained for 4 minutes and 17 seconds. "That's not supposed to happen," said Kaliseth. "We added a harmonic dampener," said Juniper, not looking up from her readings. "The frequency stabilized. You can thank Xiomara, she suggested it 20 minutes before we started." Xiomara shrugged. "It seemed obvious." "It was not obvious. It was, in fact, the kind of structural insight that took most Zephyrian graduate students their second year to develop." "What's your educational background?" Kaliseth asked Xiomara very carefully. "Materials science and nanotechnology." "Oh, and I did a year of music theory as an undergrad." "Music theory? Yeah. Helps with understanding wave patterns. It's basically the same math." She tilted her head. "Did you not know that?" Kaliseth, professor of Zephyrian science for 38 cycles, holder of 17 academic titles, had not, in fact, made that particular connection. He updated his datapad notes again. Then the door to Lab 24B burst open. "Okay, so," said a breathless voice, "I know I'm not officially on this project. Hi, Dr. Krax, I'm Brecken Yamamura-Obi, I'm in the materials group, but I was walking past and I saw the resonance readings through the window and I had an idea about parameter 14 that I think might actually." "Come in," said Kaliseth. He was getting tired of being surprised. It was easier to simply let them be remarkable. Outside, the October wind rattled the trees on the MIT campus. Inside Lab 24B, 6 humans and 1 very confused alien professor continued working on a problem that was supposed to be too hard. It was not too hard. Nothing, it was becoming clear, was too hard. Professor Vrindak Kaliseth had recalibrated his expectations approximately 17 times in the past week and a half. He had arrived on Earth expecting to observe primitive science. He had instead been watching what he could only describe in his increasingly alarmed mission notes as an organized chaos that produces inexplicably correct results with disturbing regularity. He had tried to rationalize it. Perhaps the humans were simply good at memorizing Zephyrian-adjacent techniques. But no, their methods were often entirely unlike Zephyrian methodology. Where Zephyrians approached problems with elegant, linear deduction, humans seemed to attack from 6 directions simultaneously, collide with themselves, argue, make jokes, and somehow emerge from the wreckage holding the answer. He had watched Brecken Yamamura-Obi spend 20 minutes drawing on a whiteboard while humming what appeared to be a pop song, and then produce a structural amendment to the resonance chamber design that reduced energy bleed by 30%. He had watched Devraj and Juniper get into an argument about the optimal calibration frequency that escalated into what appeared to be a genuine disagreement, complete with raised voices and a briefly thrown marker cap, and then arrive at a synthesis that was better than either of their original positions. He had watched Xiomara absent-mindedly sketch a molecular lattice on a napkin during a coffee break that, when Kaliseth quietly photographed and analyzed it, turned out to be a novel approach to energy containment that Zephyrian materials scientists had been theorizing about for 40 years. Tilrek, he said one evening, staring at his mission notes, I need you to honestly assess my original hypothesis. Tilrek sat very carefully. Your original hypothesis was that Earth represented a Tier 4 civilization, maximum Tier 3 in certain specialized fields. Yes. Current assessment? A long pause. Tier 1 emergent. Possibly Tier 1 in several fields. He set down his datapad. What I cannot understand is the mechanism. Our cognitive models predict that intelligence of this level requires stable, generational development over centuries of systematic scientific culture. These humans have had less than 300 years of organized modern science. How are they doing this? Tilrek had, in fact, been thinking about this. I have a theory, he said. Tell me. They have disadvantages, said Tilrek. Compared to Zephyrians, compared to most advanced civilizations, they have shorter lifespans, biological fragility, limited sensory range, no natural capacity for collective memory transmission. They age. They get sick. They die. Yes, and I think, said Tilrek slowly, that this makes them faster. Every generation of human researchers knows they have limited time. And every generation, instead of building slowly and carefully on what came before, they crash into the problems with everything they have. They take risks. They improvise. They work on intuition because they don't have the luxury of waiting for certainty. Kaliseth stared at his assistant. Additionally, Tilrek continued, they collaborate in ways that are somewhat disorganized but extremely cross-disciplinary. Devraj's work on neural architectures informed Juniper's approach to quantum coherence. Xiomara's materials background contributed to Brecken's resonance calculations. They don't stay in their lanes, Professor. They wander everywhere. It's messy, but the cross-contamination of ideas produces novel synthesis. Kaliseth finished quietly. Yes. Another long silence. Outside, a group of students was playing frisbee on the campus lawn, shouting and laughing with completely inappropriate enthusiasm for beings who were also, apparently, reinventing the upper limits of known science. Kaliseth watched them with an expression that had quietly, over the past week, transitioned from condescension to something considerably more complicated. Schedule the Phase 2 lab session for tomorrow, he said. The Phase 2 lab session was supposed to be the culminating experiment of Kaliseth's visit, a full-scale test of the resonance chamber at maximum parameters. If Phase 1 had been designed to reveal human limitations, Phase 2 had been redesigned, after Phase 1's embarrassing success, as something more genuine, a real scientific test of a principle that Kaliseth was actually curious about. He had not expected to still be curious about anything on Earth. And yet, the lab session began at 9 a.m. with 7 researchers, 2 technicians, enough coffee to hydrate a small country, and a resonance chamber that Devraj had spent the previous night modifying in ways he described as just felt right. Kaliseth had reviewed the modifications at midnight and found them structurally sound but operating on a principle he hadn't fully worked out yet. This bothered him more than he let on. Parameter calibration check, said Priya, running through the startup sequence. Nominal, said Xiomara. Harmonic dampener holding, said Brecken. Feedback loop stable, said Devraj. I think the new junction is performing a little differently than I modeled, but it's within, sort of within, acceptable range. Define sort of, said Kaliseth. Like, probably fine? That is not a calibration specification. It's a vibe-based calibration specification. Kaliseth looked at Tilrek. Tilrek wrote something in his log. They began the experiment at 9:14 a.m. The resonance chamber powered up smoothly, hitting its initial parameters with impressive precision. The field held stable. Readings climbed through the normal range, then into the experimental range, then into a range that Kaliseth's own equations hadn't technically predicted. Readings are exceeding projections, said Juniper, frowning at her monitor. Parameter 9 is at 140%. The feedback junction, Kaliseth said sharply. Check the new junction Devraj installed. Devraj was already looking at it. It's fine, it's okay, it's at 160, that's a little. 160, said Priya. The resonance is amplifying itself, said Kaliseth, rapidly running calculations on his datapad. The harmonic dampener is interacting with the new junction in a way that's creating a cascade effect. The chamber is self-amplifying. Is that bad? Asked Brecken. It's unexpected, said Kaliseth. Is it bad? Brecken repeated. Kaliseth's datapad showed a very fast rising curve. We need to. He didn't finish the sentence because, at that moment, the resonance chamber produced a sound like a cathedral bell being struck by a freight train, a flash of light in a wavelength that was not quite visible to human eyes but made everyone in the room instinctively duck, and then detonated outward in a contained pressure wave that knocked 7 researchers and 1 alien professor off their feet, blew 17 whiteboards off the walls, and sent approximately 3 years' worth of paper notes spiraling around the room in a dramatic tornado of academic chaos. The chamber itself was undamaged. Everything else in Lab 24B was not. There was a long ringing silence. Devraj sat up slowly. He had a lab notebook stuck to his face, which he peeled off with great dignity. So, he said. That was new. Brecken was sitting against the far wall with her safety goggles askew and a whiteboard marker in her hair. Everyone alive? A chorus of yeah, I think so, and one eloquent, ow. Kaliseth lay flat on his back on the lab floor, staring at the ceiling. His datapad was showing readings that made no sense under any known model of physics, Zephyrian or otherwise. The explosion hadn't destroyed the experiment. It had accelerated it. The resonance field had not collapsed. It had, somehow, stabilized at a higher energy level than any controlled field he had ever seen, and it was sitting inside the chamber like a benign, shimmering, impossible fact. Tilrek crawled over and sat beside him. He also looked at the ceiling for a moment. Professor, he said. The field is stable. I know. It should not be stable. I know. The energy level is. I know, Tilrek. This is going to significantly impact your research paper. I know. Pause. Also, said Tilrek very carefully, I think the evacuation alarm is about to. The evacuation alarm went off. It was very loud. Everyone filed out into the October afternoon with the slightly dazed expression of people who had just survived something extraordinary. Fire safety personnel arrived within 4 minutes, followed shortly by 3 department heads and 1 very concerned dean of science who had apparently been nearby. In the middle of the evacuation zone, Devraj was already sketching on the back of someone's crumpled paper, his face alight with the kind of excitement that no sane being should have after their lab just exploded. Okay, the junction interaction. I see it now. The harmonic feedback created a constructive interference pattern we didn't model, if we reconfigure the dampener inputs. Here? Dev, said Juniper, our lab just exploded. Yeah, but we found something, he said. Look at these numbers. Look at this. This field shouldn't exist. It does exist. That means, said Juniper slowly, looking at the numbers, that our understanding of containment physics is about 30 years out of date. At least. They looked at each other. Both of them looked at Kaliseth, who had come to stand beside them without quite realizing he'd moved. You didn't predict this, did you? Juniper said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a genuine question from a scientist to a scientist, the tone of someone who knew that unexpected results were where the real science lived. No, said Kaliseth after a pause. I didn't predict this. Neither did we, said Devraj, not sounding troubled about it at all. So we figure it out. He held out the sketch he'd been making. Kaliseth took it. He studied it. It was rough, intuitive, completely not rigorous, and it was pointing in exactly the right direction. We will need, said Kaliseth slowly, to reconfigure the primary approach entirely. Yeah, said Devraj. It's gonna be great. Behind them, the stable, impossible resonance field hummed peacefully inside the wrecked lab, waiting patiently for someone to understand it. In Kaliseth's mission log, for the first time, the field marked, expected duration before conclusions, was empty. He did not know how long this would take. He was disturbingly looking forward to finding out. The explosion made the MIT campus news. The headline read, Physics Lab produces anomalous energy event, all personnel safe, investigation ongoing. The story was accompanied by a photograph of Lab 24B's interior, which looked like a physics textbook had been through a blender, and a quote from Priya Subramaniam that said, Unexpected results are the heart of science. We're excited to investigate further. Professor Vrindak Kaliseth read the article 3 times. He paid particular attention to the phrase, unexpected results. He had been sent to Earth to produce a definitive study on human intellectual limitations. Instead, he was now a co-investigator in what his datapad quietly, damningly assessed as potentially the most significant energy physics development in this sector of the galaxy in 60 years. And the lead investigator was a 24-year-old PhD student who solved problems on vibes and ate granola bars for breakfast. He found a bench by the Charles River that morning and sat there for a long time, watching rowers move through the water below and thinking about the nature of humility. Tilrek, who had learned when to follow at a respectful distance and when to sit quietly beside the professor, chose the latter. They sat together watching the river for several minutes before Kaliseth said, "I have to file my mission update today." "I know," said Tilrek. "The Zephyrian Science Council is expecting a confirmation of Earth's Tier 4 classification." "I know. If I revise that assessment to Tier 1 emergent, it will be the largest classification revision in documented xenological history," said Tilrek. "By a considerable margin. The previous record was the Velinoy revision of 2,400 years ago, which moved the Calanthe from Tier 3 to Tier 2. And the Council's reaction to that revision was a decade-long academic controversy." "Correct." Kaliseth watched a rowing shell glide past. 8 humans moving in perfect synchrony, wordless, their oars striking the water with metronomic precision. Team coordination. Complementary skills. A shared objective. "Tell me something, Tilrek," he said. "How did you find this assignment? When I dismissed your observations in the first days, when you were trying to tell me the scans were showing interesting data, what did you think?" Tilrek was quiet for a moment. He was 22 years old and not accustomed to his supervisor asking for his honest opinion. "I thought," he said carefully, "that you were pattern matching to your prior expectations instead of attending to the actual data." Pause. "You would have been correct," said Kaliseth. "I didn't say." "You would have been correct," the professor repeated, not unkindly. "I arrived here with a conclusion already written and was looking for evidence to support it. That is not science. That is theater." The river moved. Geese argued near the bank. "File the preliminary update," said Kaliseth. "Honestly, whatever the council says, the data is the data." That afternoon, in the encrypted subspace communications room they had set up in the ship, currently parked in geostationary orbit over the North Atlantic, cloaked and extremely bored, Kaliseth made the call. The face that appeared on the quantum comms screen was Senior Council member Avalith Dran, a being so ancient and distinguished that her skin had taken on a slight luminescent quality and her 4 eyes had turned the pale gold of Zephyrian age. She was 300 years old, had survived 6 major academic controversies, and did not look like someone who appreciated surprises. "Professor Kaliseth," she said. "Your preliminary assessment. We've been looking forward to it." "Senior Council member," said Kaliseth. "I must revise my filed parameters before delivering the assessment." Pause. "Revise how?" "Significantly." He forwarded the data package. "I am recommending a reclassification of Earth from Tier 4 developing to Tier 1 emergent. The evidence is comprehensive and independently verifiable." The silence that followed lasted long enough that Kaliseth wondered if the connection had dropped. Then, Tier 1. "You are saying Tier 1. "Correct. Professor, the Tier 1 classification is reserved for civilizations within 2 centuries of achieving." "I am aware of what Tier 1 means," said Kaliseth. "I've written 4 papers on civilizational classification criteria. I am applying those criteria honestly to what I have observed." Another silence. Council member Dran appeared to be reading the data package. Her expression underwent several changes, ending somewhere between astonishment and something that might have been respect. "This energy field," she said, "the one produced during the lab event, is stable. Still stable. They've been running continuous measurements for 18 hours. The containment is holding." He paused. "They're calling it the Kraxosay field, after 2 of the principal researchers. One of whom is you. One of whom is me, using a human alias, which presents a small diplomatic complexity I'd like to discuss separately." Council member Dran set down the data package she'd been reading. "How?" she said, and for the first time in 300 years she sounded genuinely uncertain. "How did they get here this fast?" "I have a theory," said Kaliseth. He shared what Tilrek had told him by the river, his own observations, his revised models. He talked about the particular hunger of beings who knew they were temporary, the urgency that mortality installed in every human researcher, the way they threw themselves at problems not with Zephyrian patience but with a kind of joyful, furious creativity. He talked about interdisciplinary collision. He talked about intuition as a genuine cognitive tool rather than a pre-rigorous placeholder. He talked about the sophomore PhD student who built a thinking machine from gaming parts and leftover hope. He talked for 45 minutes. When he finished, Dran said, "You've changed your mind." "I've corrected an error," said Kaliseth. "That's a different thing." "And what do you want to do?" "About the mission." "About them. First contact protocols are the Council's decision, not mine. but for the mission. He glanced at the window where clouds drifted over the North Atlantic far below. I'd like to request an extension. 6 months minimum. The Craxosay field alone warrants a full year of study. I want to understand the mechanism. And I want to understand how they got here because I suspect the answer to that question matters. Matters how? The rest of the galaxy, said Kaliseth, has been assuming we are alone at the top. I think we need to reconsider our assumptions. Council member Dran said nothing for a long moment. Then, extension granted. File weekly reports. Of course. And Kaliseth? Yes. I notice you said, we, when referring to the top of the civilizational tier. He thought about that. A habit of thought, he said. One I may need to revise. Dran's 4 eyes held something that might have been amusement. Filed. Dismissed. The channel closed. Tilrek appeared from the monitoring station with the look of someone who had been listening to everything and was trying extremely hard to look like he hadn't. Professor? Extension approved. We stay. Tilrek's face broke into genuine, undisguised delight. He had been quietly, deeply fascinated by every single person at MIT since approximately hour 2, and had been documenting everything with the enthusiasm of a graduate student who had accidentally landed in the most interesting field site in the galaxy. Also, said Kaliseth, standing, we're going back to the lab this afternoon. Devraj believes he's identified the mechanism for the field's self-stabilization. He identified it already? He texted me the rough outline at 6 this morning. Pause. He apparently woke up with an idea and couldn't sleep. Tilrek thought about this. He woke up with a galaxy-class physics breakthrough. He described it as, Kaliseth checked his message, quote, okay, so I had a thought. They walked toward the transport. Below them, Cambridge went about its afternoon. Students debating, researchers arguing, someone playing guitar outside the student union, coffee being consumed at an extraordinary rate by people who were changing the world between seminars. Tilrek, said Kaliseth as they walked. Yes, Professor? When I was wrong in the beginning, you tried to tell me. I did try, yes. You were right to try. Even when I dismissed you. He paused. That was good science. And I should have listened. Tilrek said nothing for a moment. Then, does this mean I can update my log to reflect that I was the first to suggest? Don't push it, said Kaliseth. But he was unmistakably almost smiling. 3 months after the explosion that rearranged Lab 24B and quietly rearranged Professor Vrindak Kaliseth's entire cosmological worldview, a great deal had changed. Lab 24B had been rebuilt, with improvements. The resonance chamber now occupied the center of a completely redesigned space that looked, as Brecken Yamamura-Obi described it, like someone designed a lab that actually respects the experiment. The Craxosay field had been replicated 17 times, each iteration more controlled and better understood. A preliminary paper had been submitted to 3 different journals simultaneously, which was unprecedented and which the journal's editorial boards were currently dealing with at a volume of communication that could only be described as spirited. The paper's authors included Dr. Wendell Crax, Devraj Osei, Juniper Adderley Qualsh, Xiomara Reyes-Fontaine, Brecken Yamamura-Obi, and one Theo Crax, listed as research support. Theo, the alias of Tilrek Asavain, had contributed extensively to the data analysis sections and written most of the appendices, despite his official status as a graduate student observer. I don't understand why you keep calling yourself, just observing, Devraj told him one afternoon. You caught that measurement error in section 4 that none of us saw. You basically saved the paper. Tilrek was so pleased he had to look at his shoes for a moment to prevent his expression from becoming incriminating. Professor Kaliseth, meanwhile, had quietly become something unexpected. A respected colleague rather than a visiting observer. His knowledge was extraordinary and his willingness to apply it, once he had set aside his need to be superior, turned out to be immensely valuable. He caught things. He asked questions that nobody else had thought to ask. He approached problems with a patience and systematic rigor that complemented the team's explosive, intuitive style in ways that produced repeatedly better science than either approach alone. He was also, though he would not have admitted it under quantum-enhanced interrogation, having the most intellectually stimulating period of his career. He had begun keeping a second set of notes, not mission logs, not official assessments, but personal observations. About humans. About the way they thought. About the way they treated each other in the lab, which was sometimes chaotic and occasionally profane and genuinely collaborative in a way he had not expected. About Devraj's habit of sharing credit even when he didn't have to. About the way Juniper could be working on 3 things and still stop everything if a colleague needed to think something through. About Xiomara, who once spent an hour explaining her field to an undergraduate who had wandered into the wrong lab, because, as she put it, someone explained it to me once and it changed everything. He observed that humans made more mistakes per hour than Zephyrians. He also observed that this appeared to be related to the fact that they made more discoveries per hour than Zephyrians. The connection was not lost on him. The crisis, when it came, arrived on a Tuesday, which Kaliseth had come to associate with unexpected developments, given that his first day on campus had also been a Tuesday. Devraj was running a late refinement of the Kraxosei field when his neural architecture prototype, the shoebox still running, still solving problems, now connected to the lab systems for data processing, produced a very strange output. He looked at it for several minutes, then called Juniper. Juniper looked at it and called Xiomara. Xiomara read it twice and called Priya. The output was a sequence of calculations that the prototype had produced independently. They were not calculations anyone had asked it to perform. They were, however, calculations related to the Kraxosei field, specifically, a projection of what the field would produce at scales significantly larger than anything they'd tested. The numbers were extraordinary and slightly terrifying. Priya brought the output to Kaliseth at 11 p.m., when he was still in his office working through data from the day's experiments. She laid it on his desk without preamble. He read it. He ran calculations. He read it again. This is what the machine produced, Priya said. Independently, he confirmed. It wasn't prompted. No. He set it down. Your prototype, he said, the one Devraj built from gaming parts and intuition, has apparently modeled a form of field generation at macro scale that would constitute a functional interstellar energy source. He paused. A clean one. Effectively limitless. Priya was very still. Is it right? I've been checking the math for 20 minutes. He looked at her. It is right. A silence. So, said Priya slowly. Yes. We built something that might change everything. That is an accurate summary. She sat down across from him. They looked at each other, the human scientist and the alien professor in a human suit, sitting in a small office at MIT at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday, looking at a printout that had just changed the shape of the future. I need to tell you something, said Kaliseth. Okay, said Priya. He had thought about how to do this for several weeks. He had consulted with Tilrek, who had consulted with their mission protocols, and with Council Member Dran, who had authorized what she called a discretionary disclosure, given the extraordinary circumstances. He had drafted and redrafted 17 different approaches. He said, I am not from Geneva. Priya looked at him. I know, she said. Pause. You know. Dr. Wendell Krax from Geneva is not a real person in any of the physics databases. I checked. Also, you called the electromagnetic spectrum, the lower optical register, twice in conversation and didn't seem to notice. And Theo, whatever his name actually is, once corrected a piece of data in units that don't exist in any human measurement system. Kaliseth looked at the ceiling. Tilrek, he muttered. So, said Priya, folding her hands on the desk in the manner of a person who was extremely calm about something enormous. Aliens. You're aliens. Yes. What kind? He looked at her for a moment, then shifted. The biological adjustment peeled back around his face, just his face, revealing the lavender skin and the 4 amber eyes of a Zephyrian. He let her see him for a moment, then the adjustment restored. Priya Subramaniam, associate chair of the physics department, took a very slow breath. Okay, she said. So what happens now? That, said Kaliseth, is genuinely unclear. Formal first contact is a council decision that will take considerable time. But I believe, and I have submitted this recommendation, that something should be acknowledged. You have produced something that merits acknowledgement across civilizational lines. He tapped the printout. The Kraxosei field at macro scale is not just a physics breakthrough. It's a civilizational threshold crossing. You crossed it in 3 months. From an explosion. From an explosion, Priya agreed. That was partially caused by a component Devraj calibrated on vibes. That does sound right. Pause. They both quietly started laughing. It was the laughter of people sitting in the wreckage of a completely revised reality, choosing to find it funny because the alternative was too vast to process standing up. What do we tell the team? Priya asked. The truth, said Kaliseth. Eventually. When there's a protocol for it. He looked at the printout again. But the paper we publish as it is under the names that are on it. Devraj's name. Juniper's name. Xiamaris Breckens. Whatever I am or where I'm from, that work is theirs. And yours, said Priya. He considered this. And mine. Yes. The next morning, Kalaseth sent his final mission summary to the council. He spent 3 hours writing it, and it was the most honest document he had produced in 38 years of science. He described what he had expected to find. He described what he had found instead. He described his errors, his recalibrations, and what he believed they meant. He described Devraj's shoebox and what it had become. He described the lab explosion and the impossible field that had stabilized in its aftermath. And at the end he wrote, I came to Earth to observe a primitive civilization. I leave, temporarily, having observed something considerably more complex. A civilization that has converted limitation into accelerant, urgency into innovation, and chaos into discovery. They are not primitive. They are early, which is an entirely different thing. And early things that move this fast require attention. We have been watching the wrong metrics. Intelligence is not measured by stability and age alone. It can also be measured by what a species does with the time it has. These humans are doing extraordinary things with the time they have. Recommendation, continued engagement. Open dialogue at earliest council-approved opportunity. In the meantime, watch them. They are not done surprising us. They are, I suspect, only just beginning. He filed the summary and leaned back in his chair. Outside it was a clear Cambridge morning. From where he sat, he could see Lab 24B's windows where lights were already on. Someone was there early. Probably Devraj, chasing a new idea with a bad coffee and the particular kind of joy that lived in people for whom the universe was an endless, magnificent problem. Tilrek appeared in the doorway. The council acknowledged receipt of the summary. And? Council member Dran says, and I'm quoting directly, tell him he was right. I hate that he was right. He was right. Kalaseth smiled. 4 eyes, briefly visible, lit with genuine warmth. Tell her, he said, that being right matters less than being honest. And that I learned that here. Tilrek sent the message. Downstairs in Lab 24B, the Kraxosay field hummed in its chamber, stable, impossible, already pointing toward a future that a week ago hadn't existed. Devraj arrived at 7 a.m. with 2 coffees and a new notebook, already full of writing. On the cover, in his messy handwriting, were 3 words that Professor Vrindak Kalaseth, when he found out about it later, would privately consider the most accurate summary of everything he had witnessed. What happens next?